They said she eats like a pig. My daughter said it, at her own wedding, in front of her new husband's family, the photographers, the waiters, and me, her mother, sitting 2 tables away, trying to make a piece of salmon behave on a too small fork. That sentence has lived in my body ever since, like a shard of glass too shallow to bleed, but too deep to forget. I am 81 now, and most of the people from that night have drifted out of my orbit. I live alone above a bakery on a street that smells of yeast and diesel and the faint sweetness of overripe fruit from the market down the block. The apartment is small, 2 rooms and a kettle that whistles like an old friend when the water boils. But I have peace here. I have time, and I have that sentence, echoing sometimes when I stir my tea, when I fold laundry, when I hear young women laughing downstairs. The wedding was in late spring, one of those days that pretends to be warm until the sun goes down and the air reminds you who is in charge. They'd rented a vineyard an hour outside the city, long tables, white drapery, strings of lights hanging between olive trees that someone had probably hired a truck to deliver because nothing that perfect grows in that soil. My daughter Eloise had been planning it for over a year, though she never once asked what I thought. Not that I expected her to. She and I had been circling each other for years, orbiting without touching, like planets that once shared gravity and now only share history. She wanted a clean start, she said, a modern ceremony, elegant and simple, which meant, apparently, no lace, no sentimental speeches, and no mother fussing over her. I told her I'd wear whatever color she wanted. She said, "Maybe something muted. We don't want you standing out too much." I remember that morning vividly, the hotel room filled with the sound of hair dryers and the click of phone cameras. I had bought her a pearl bracelet, real ones, not costume, with money from the savings I'd been keeping for her since she was a child. I left it on the vanity with a note that said, "For the hand that held mine first." She never wore it. When I came by later to help with the veil, she thanked me for the thought and handed it to one of her bridesmaids to pack away. I didn't take it personally at the time. Mothers learn to swallow small cuts before they turn into scars. By the time the ceremony began, the air had turned gold and heavy, the kind of light that flatters everyone except the old. The photographer asked me to move slightly to the side, for symmetry. I obeyed, though I could see from the preview on his camera that I was already half out of the frame. Eloise looked radiant, truly. Her dress was simple but precise, a column of white silk that caught the light like water. When she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, my ex-husband, clean-shaven for the first time in years, I felt something break loose inside me, something equal parts pride and mourning. We had built her together, after all. We had failed together, too. The reception was loud and choreographed, a blur of applause, toasts, laughter that didn't reach the eyes. I was seated near the back, close enough to see, but not enough to be seen. It didn't surprise me. Eloise had always been careful about appearances, about what parts of her life she allowed people to see. She introduced me once to her in-laws with a smile that didn't falter. "This is my mom. She's retired." The pause before retired was surgical, as if she were editing my life in real time. I had worked 38 years as a nurse. I had delivered babies, stitched wounds, sat beside men as they died. But to her, I was retired, past tense, past relevance. I don't remember what song was playing when it happened. Something upbeat, something people could dance to without meaning it. I was eating quietly, grateful that no one had asked me to make a toast. The salmon was overcooked, the bread already stale at the edges. I had skipped lunch because the makeup artist had taken longer than expected, and I didn't want to ruin the dress I'd borrowed. So when the food finally came, I was hungry enough to forget that everyone else was watching the couple spin on the dance floor, until I heard her voice, sharp, amused, directed toward someone at her table. "Oh, look," she said, "she eats like a pig." Laughter followed, brittle and polite. A few heads turned toward me and away again, the way people look at a car accident they pretend not to see. I froze, fork midair, then set it down carefully beside the plate. I didn't raise my head. My heart didn't even speed up. It just folded. That's the only way I can describe it. Folded in on itself, quietly, neatly, like laundry you put away so no one can see the stain. I remember noticing how beautiful the glass looked in the candlelight, how it caught the reflection of the fairy lights above. I reached for it, just to give my hand something to do. And then, moments later, there was commotion, a gasp, a scraping of chairs, the sound of someone choking. It was her, the bride, my daughter, standing with one hand at her throat, eyes wide, face turning the color of old roses. People shouted. Someone called for water. Someone else froze. And there I was, the only one holding a full glass, the same one I'd been staring into a moment before. For a second, I didn't move. Not because I wanted her to suffer. God knows I've never wanted that. But because something in me hesitated, as if time had reversed, and I was looking at her as a child again, gasping for air when she swallowed a grape whole, and I'd pounded her small back until she breathed again. My hands remembered before my mind did. I stood, walked to her, and pressed the glass into her shaking fingers. She drank, coughed, breathed. The music stopped. Applause started. Someone said, "Her mother saved her," and laughter rippled again, this time relieved. She didn't look at me. Not once. She sat down, composed herself, dabbed at her lipstick with a napkin. When I returned to my seat, my plate had been cleared away. The tablecloth had a faint stain where the water had splashed. I dabbed at it with my napkin, as though cleaning it would make the moment disappear. For the rest of the evening, people avoided my eyes, as if afraid I might expect gratitude. After the cake was cut, I slipped outside for air. The vineyard stretched into darkness, rows of vines whispering in the wind. I could see the glow of the reception tent behind me, hear the laughter, the clinking glasses, the photographer calling for one more with the family. My feet hurt. My hands smelled faintly of wine and roses from the centerpiece I'd held onto when no one claimed it. I stood there for a long time, wondering when exactly I'd stopped being part of her story and become just a character she edited out. When I returned inside, they were dancing again. Someone had moved my seat closer to the kitchen door, perhaps to make room for the younger guests. I didn't mind. I watched her dance with her husband, their movements smooth and rehearsed. I watched the lights shimmer on her veil, the one I had hand-stitched weeks before, even though she never thanked me. And I thought, maybe that's motherhood, doing invisible work for people who pretend you're not there. By the time the night ended, my back ached and my cheeks hurt from smiling. She hugged me quickly at the door, perfumed and perfect, her eyes already searching for someone else. "Thanks for coming, Mom," she said, as if I were a guest. I wanted to tell her that I had loved her every day of her life, even the ones she made impossible, but I didn't. I just said, "You're welcome," and stepped into the cold night. The driver she'd arranged was nowhere to be found, so I waited under a tree while the last guests drove away. The lights dimmed one by one until only the music remained, a soft hum in the distance. I looked at my reflection in the dark window of the vineyard's office and barely recognized the woman staring back. Lipstick faded, hair flattened, eyes too tired to shine. "She eats like a pig," I whispered to my own reflection, and then I laughed, quietly, because somehow it didn't hurt as much as I expected. That night, back at the hotel, I took off the dress carefully, folded it over the chair, and washed my hands 3 times, as if I could scrub the humiliation away. The bracelet I'd given her was still in its box on the vanity. I put it back in my purse. Maybe one day her daughter will wear it. Maybe she won't, but I'll keep it clean until then. Sometimes late at night, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't moved so quickly with that glass. Not that I wish her harm, but I can't help thinking about how fragile everything is, how easily love turns into performance, how a moment can divide a life into before and after. People always talk about weddings as beginnings, but for me, that night was an ending, the end of illusions, the end of waiting for apologies that never come. Now, when I pour myself a glass of water, I take a slow sip and watch the ripples settle. It reminds me that silence, too, can drown you if you hold it too long. I saved her once more, because that's what mothers do. But that was the last time. The next morning, I woke up in the hotel room with a taste of metal in my mouth, as if I had bitten my tongue in my sleep. The window was cracked open, letting in the distant hum of cars leaving the countryside, and the leftover scent of flowers that had already begun to rot in their vases. I sat up slowly, still wearing the thin robe provided by the hotel, and looked at the chair where my dress hung, crumpled but spotless. For a few seconds, I tried to recall the night before without emotion, like a nurse reviewing a case file. Time of incident, location, patient stable. It helped me breathe, but memory isn't clinical. It seeps, and once it started, it flooded everything. Her voice again, the laughter, the choking, the way her hand trembled when she took the glass, the way she never looked at me afterward. It all came back like fever. I packed my things carefully. I have always been meticulous. Years of hospital work teach you that control is survival. When everything around you collapses, you count your gauze, label your vials, close each drawer before moving to the next. That's how you stay sane. So I folded the dress, wrapped the shoes in tissue, checked the drawer to make sure I hadn't left the bracelet behind. It was there, in its small white box, untouched. I slipped it into my bag and left the room key on the nightstand. I didn't go to the post-wedding brunch. I couldn't. My invitation had been an afterthought anyway, scrawled in smaller print on a group text she sent to close family and friends. I was neither, apparently. At the reception desk, the young man checking me out recognized me. "Oh, you're the bride's mother," he said, cheerful, polite. "Beautiful ceremony yesterday. You must be proud." I nodded, smiled. "Very." My voice didn't shake, but inside I felt the strange lightness that comes after a blow you didn't see coming, a hollowing, almost calm. I walked outside and waited for the taxi I'd ordered. The sky was still pale, the air wet with morning. Workers were dismantling the tents at the vineyard across the road. I could see white tablecloths bundled into plastic bins, chairs stacked like bones, floral arrangements dumped into black bags. By afternoon, nothing would be left to prove a wedding had happened there at all. It struck me then how easy it is to erase evidence when everyone agrees not to look too closely. The taxi driver was an older man, kind eyes, silent. I was grateful. I didn't want conversation. The ride to the train station took 40 minutes, long enough for the silence to harden into thought. Somewhere between the hills and the city limits, I made a quiet decision. I would stop chasing people who only looked at me when they needed something. It was not anger that decided it, but exhaustion. Anger burns, exhaustion hollows. You can rebuild from ashes, but from hollowness, only silence grows. At the station, I bought the first ticket back to the city. While waiting, I found myself scrolling through the wedding photos Eloise had already posted online. There she was, luminous in every frame, holding hands with her husband, laughing with friends, surrounded by petals, champagne, perfection. I zoomed in, out of morbid curiosity, searching for any trace of myself. Nothing, not even in the background. She had managed to crop me out entirely, as though I had never existed. I sat there staring at the screen until the letters blurred. Then I deleted the app. When I returned home, the apartment felt different. Smaller, quieter, almost embarrassed to have witnessed my absence. I placed my bag on the chair, hung the dress in the closet, and sat at the kitchen table without turning on the light. The city outside was alive. Sirens, dogs, someone arguing on the street. But in that small room, time slowed until I could hear my own pulse. I realized I had been waiting for something, an apology, a call, any sign that she had noticed the wrongness of what she had done. None came, only silence, sharp and deliberate. 2 days later, the postman knocked. A large envelope, heavy, elegant. I thought foolishly it might be a thank you note. I opened it carefully. Inside was a printed card with gold trim. Mr. and Mrs. Harlan, thank you for your contribution to our wedding celebration. Beneath that, a typed note from Eloise. Mom, I hope you enjoyed yourself. The caterer mentioned an issue with the table linens. An additional fee of $240 was charged. I'll forward you the invoice. Could you cover it, please? It's only fair since it was your table. No greeting, no warmth, not even her handwriting, just cold, efficient text. The line about fairness made me laugh out loud. Fairness, from a woman who had erased me from her own photographs. I didn't respond. Instead, I went to the sink, filled a glass with water, and drank it slowly, deliberately. I thought of that night again, how she had needed me, how her life had balanced for a moment in my trembling hands. I could have let the silence last 1 second longer, just one, and everything would have been different. It frightened me, how natural the thought felt. But mothers don't stop being mothers because their children stop deserving them. That's the curse of it. We love beyond reason, and sometimes against reason. The next morning I went for a walk. It was Sunday, the streets half empty, the bakery downstairs still closed. I walked without direction, only to move, to keep from sinking into my chair and becoming part of the furniture. I passed a florist tossing wilted flowers into a bin. I stopped and asked if I could take some. She smiled, surprised. They're for the trash, but sure. I gathered a handful of half-dead roses, stems soft, petals bruised. Back home, I trimmed them, placed them in a chipped vase, and set them by the window. They looked alive again, in a tired sort of way. I understood them. By afternoon, I found myself at my writing desk, the one I hadn't used in years. I opened a drawer and took out a small stack of old letters Eloise had written me from college. Short, perfunctory notes, mostly requests for money or sympathy. Mom, rent's late again. Can you help with the deposit? I might come home this weekend if it's not weird with Dad. I read them slowly, one by one, until they blurred into a single long demand. Then I placed them back, tied with a ribbon, not out of affection, but as evidence, proof that I hadn't imagined the imbalance. That evening, the phone rang. Her name flashed on the screen. For a moment, I considered not answering, but old habits die harder than pride. Hello? I said, steady. Her voice was bright, casual, as if the wedding had gone perfectly. "Hi, Mom. Just checking you got home okay." "I did," I said. "It was a lovely wedding." "Wasn't it?" she chirped. "Everyone said the vineyard was magical. Oh, and listen, about that invoice. I'll send it over tonight. It's just a formality, really." I closed my eyes. "Of course," I said. "A formality. Thanks, Mom. You're the best." Click. The line went dead. I sat there staring at the silent phone, my reflection caught in the black screen. For the first time in my life, I realized that love, when unreturned, curdles into something dangerous, not hatred, but indifference. And indifference, in its purest form, is freedom. Later that night, I opened my checkbook, wrote out the amount she claimed I owed, then tore the page neatly in half. I placed one half in an envelope addressed to her. The other I burned over the sink. The paper curled, blackened, and disappeared. The ashes fell like snow. I felt lighter, though not yet clean. In the days that followed, I stopped expecting anything from her. The world didn't end. No lightning struck. Instead, something quieter happened. The stillness inside me began to breathe again. I realized that the moment she choked wasn't just physical. It was symbolic. For a brief instant, the power between us reversed. She had been gasping, dependent, stripped of her performance, and I had been the one standing, calm, capable, necessary. It wasn't vengeance. It was revelation. The universe, for one blink, reminding her who had fed her first, who had saved her then, and who was saving her still. That understanding, cruel as it sounds, was the beginning of my release. The wedding wasn't humiliation. It was diagnosis, a clear image of what I had refused to see for years, that my daughter didn't hate me, not exactly. She feared becoming me. Age, softness, imperfection, everything I embodied, she was desperate to escape. And in her cruelty, she was only trying to kill the reflection she saw in me. Once I understood that, I stopped bleeding. I began to let the wound scar. That was the catalyst, the turning. Not her insult, not even the choking, but the stillness afterward. The moment when I realized I didn't owe anyone my silence or my suffering anymore. The world outside my window kept moving. Buses, birds, children shouting after school. Life went on, indifferent to my small tragedy. And in that indifference, I found an odd kind of mercy. For the first time in decades, I wasn't waiting for anyone to call my name. I was just breathing, quietly, on my own. The week after the wedding, I found myself caught in a strange rhythm, the kind of quiet that follows a storm when nothing seems broken, but everything feels slightly out of place. My days returned to their predictable shape: breakfast at 7, tea at 11, the evening news at 6. But inside me, something had shifted so completely that even the sound of my own footsteps on the linoleum felt foreign. I had spent 80 years living in orbit around other people's needs, my husband's temper, my patient's pain, my daughter's ambitions, and now, suddenly, there was nothing pulling me toward anyone. It was like learning to breathe in a vacuum. For the first few days, I did what I always do when I'm uncertain. I cleaned. The apartment gleamed. I scrubbed the stove until it reflected my face, sorted the old linens, threw away the things that had stopped belonging to me a long time ago: his slippers, her school trophies, the Christmas cards from people who signed only their last names. But the quiet persisted, too clean, too neat, like a room where someone has died and everyone's pretending they haven't noticed. On Thursday, I went downstairs to the bakery, the one below my apartment. It was owned by a woman named Beatrice, round-faced and brisk, always covered in flour, as if she lived in a small personal snowstorm. For years I'd been her customer, exchanging pleasantries about the weather and my blood pressure. But that morning, I asked if she needed help. She blinked, surprised, and then said, "You mean a job?" I nodded. She hesitated only a second. Mornings are chaos. If you can handle coffee and small talk, you're hired. Just like that, I had something to do again. The next morning, I tied on an apron that smelled faintly of yeast and detergent and stood behind the counter while the first wave of customers shuffled in, half asleep, impatient for caffeine. I hadn't worked since retirement 15 years earlier, and my hands trembled a little, not from weakness, but from the thrill of use. I remembered how it felt to be needed, even in a small way, to pour, to serve, to listen. There's a dignity in motion that the stillness of age quietly robs from you. At first, I told myself it was only temporary, a distraction to fill the hours that had become too sharp to face. But within a week, the bakery began to feel like a small, sturdy world I could stand inside without shrinking. The regulars started to learn my name. A man with paint on his hands always ordered 2 black coffees and called me Doc because I reminded him of his grandmother who'd been a nurse. A group of young women came in every morning at 8, laughing, their perfume clinging to the air long after they left. Sometimes they reminded me of Eloise at that age, so certain the world was made for them. I didn't envy them. I only hoped someone would look at them gently when their certainty cracked. I didn't tell my daughter I'd started working again. She wouldn't have understood. To her, work was something you outgrew, like acne or kindness. But every morning as I slipped into my apron, I felt a quiet defiance, a pulse of something that wasn't bitterness, but proof. Proof that I was still here, still able to give and earn and exist without her permission. The first time I took home a small envelope of cash, $47 for 3 shifts, I held it in my hands like a relic. It wasn't the amount that mattered. It was that no one else could claim it. It was the first money I'd earned for myself in almost 2 decades, unshared, unasked for, unthanked. I placed it in a jar on my nightstand. I didn't plan to spend it. I just needed to see it there, physical evidence that I was real. Around that time, the emails from Eloise started coming. Not many, not kind, but regular enough to keep the wound fresh. "Mom, did you get the invoice yet?" "Mom, please confirm you sent the transfer." "Mom, it's not a big deal. Just take care of it." I read them but never replied. Eventually they stopped. When silence returned, it wasn't relief I felt, but a faint vertigo, like standing too close to the edge of something vast. I began to realize that estrangement isn't a single event. It's a slow process of unthreading. You don't wake up one day and stop being a mother. You just start collecting the moments where your love has nowhere to go. One evening after closing, Beatrice invited me to stay for tea. The bakery was quiet, smelling of sugar and heat. She poured the tea into mismatched mugs, the way people do when they trust you enough to skip the ceremony. "You live alone, right?" she asked. I nodded. "Family close by?" "In a way," I said, and she didn't press. She told me about her late husband, how he'd died young and left her the shop as a consolation prize. "I used to think this place was my punishment," she said. "Now I think it's my second chance." I listened, nodded, felt something in me settle. Maybe that's what I had been waiting for without knowing it. A life small enough to fit again. As autumn crept in, the city began to change its colors, and I found myself walking longer routes home from work. I liked the way dusk softened everything, the way the world seemed to forgive itself a little in the fading light. One evening, as I passed a consignment shop, a navy blue coat in the window caught my eye. Wool, mid-length, with deep pockets and a single row of buttons. The tag said $60. I stood there for a long time, tracing the outline of my reflection against the glass. I hadn't bought myself anything new in years. Every dress, every scarf, every little thing I owned had been purchased with someone else in mind. A dinner with Eloise, a family gathering, a holiday card photo. This would be different. This would be mine. I walked inside, tried it on. It fit perfectly, like the coat had been waiting for me to arrive. I paid in cash from my jar and wore it home that night, even though it was too warm for wool. The sleeves brushed against my wrists, comforting, steady. It felt like armor stitched out of ordinary fabric. That purchase marked the first small escalation in the quiet rebellion I didn't yet recognize as my own. After the coat came other acts of quiet defiance, taking myself to lunch without a book for company, deleting Eloise's number from my favorites list, buying a small radio to fill the silence with music instead of her absence. Each thing seemed insignificant on its own, but together they formed a pattern, a slow migration towards something I hadn't dared to name, independence. Then one morning, a letter arrived. The envelope was plain, the handwriting careful. It wasn't Eloise's. Inside was a short note from my granddaughter, Lila. "Grandma, I found your photo in one of Mom's albums. She said you don't visit much. I miss you, even though I barely know you. Can I write you sometimes?" I read it 3 times. The handwriting was large, uncertain, 12 years old. I wrote back immediately, not to reopen old wounds, but because a child had reached for me without agenda. "Of course you can write," I said. "I'll always answer." It was the first time in months I felt something like love that didn't hurt. Weeks passed. The bakery grew busier, the mornings colder. Beatrice began to trust me with the register, the deliveries, even the key. Some evenings I stayed late, cleaning the counters while the city outside dimmed into a soft blur. It wasn't happiness exactly, but it was peace, and that was better. Every so often, someone from my old life would appear, a neighbor, a former co-worker, and ask about Eloise. I always said she was doing well, that she was busy, that she had her own family now. I never mentioned the wedding. People like their stories tidy. Still, there were moments when the ache returned, sudden and precise. Once, a young bride came into the bakery to order a wedding cake, and I caught myself staring at her, wondering if her mother would be seated near the restroom too. Another time, I saw Eloise's photo in a magazine feature about local entrepreneurs, her smile dazzling, her husband's hand resting on her shoulder, and beneath it, the caption, "Self-Made Success." I laughed out loud in the grocery aisle, the sound startling even me. Self-made, if only they knew. That night, I walked home through a drizzle, my navy coat damp at the cuffs, the city lights reflected in the puddles like scattered stars. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel invisible. I felt unseen by choice. There's a difference. I thought of the glass of water, of the way it had glinted between us like a mirror, and I realized that I had spent too many years holding things for others, glasses, hopes, apologies, while no one ever thought to ask if I was thirsty too. Now finally, I was learning to drink first. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. There were no speeches, no revelations shouted into the night. Just a quiet, steady change, like a tide pulling away from a shore that no longer offered safe landing. I began to understand that distance isn't cruelty. Sometimes it's survival. And as I stood in my kitchen that evening, steam rising from the kettle, I whispered to the empty room, "You can love someone and still walk away." The words sounded foreign at first, then truer with each repetition. By the time the water boiled, I almost believed them. That was the first escalation, not in rage or revenge, but in awakening, the slow reclaiming of a life that had been traded piece by piece for belonging. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in decades, I wanted to find out. The shift began quietly, almost politely, the way seasons change while you're not paying attention. One morning, I woke earlier than usual, long before dawn, and couldn't fall back asleep. The street outside was still wrapped in darkness, the bakery below silent, the city holding its breath before the machinery of morning began. I lay in bed listening to the sound of my heartbeat in the pillow and thought, without bitterness, that I was no longer waiting for my daughter to remember me. The thought startled me, not because it was sad, but because it was clean. It had no edges left, no sting, just the clarity of something accepted. For the first time in years, the silence felt like mine, not something imposed on me by another person. I rose, made tea, opened the window to let in the pre-dawn air, and watched the faint line of light creep between the buildings. It wasn't peace yet, but it was something like the rehearsal of it. At the bakery, the morning crowd came and went as usual, but I noticed I was moving differently, less like someone surviving the day and more like someone inhabiting it. The regulars smiled wider when they saw me, and I began to recognize their rhythms. The man with the paint-stained hands came at 6:45, the nurse at 7:15, the old couple at 8 on the dot. I started to remember their orders before they spoke, and they started to linger a little longer, asking about my day, telling me about theirs. There's something healing about being known, even in such small transactional ways. When Beatrice handed me a key to the shop one afternoon, she said, "You open tomorrow. I trust you." And it felt like a kind of quiet promotion in life itself. That evening, walking home, I caught my reflection in a shop window and realized I looked less like a ghost of someone's mother and more like a person who still had chapters left. My face hadn't changed, but my posture had, my shoulders less bowed, my steps less tentative. The world hadn't become kinder, but it had stopped feeling like a witness to my humiliation. I was building a rhythm of my own, even if it was small and fragile. Still, there were reminders. One afternoon, I received another envelope with Eloise's handwriting. My name was written too neatly, as if politeness could disguise distance. Inside, a formal printed invitation, a fundraiser gala for her husband's firm, with a handwritten note. "Thought you might enjoy dressing up for a night. Bring a guest if you'd like." No apology, no affection, just an invitation to an audience. I stared at it for a long time before folding it neatly and slipping it into the drawer with the others. That night, I baked a loaf of bread for the first time in years, kneading the dough until my arms ached. There's something deeply human about creating something with your hands, something that rises, transforms, becomes nourishment. I thought about how much of my life had been spent feeding people who never noticed they were being fed. I decided then that from now on, anything I made, food, comfort, love, would be given only to those who could taste it. The next week brought rain, the kind that lingers for days, soft and relentless. The city smelled of wet earth and rust. Business at the bakery slowed, and Beatrice took to closing early. On one of those damp afternoons, she suggested we visit a small cafe across town that her friend owned. "You should get out," she said. "You've been living like a monk." I laughed, the sound unfamiliar in my own throat, and agreed. The cafe was tucked between a laundromat and a florist, the air thick with coffee and old jazz. We sat by the window, and she told me about her plans to sell the bakery next year and retire to the coast. "Maybe you can run it after me," she said, half teasing. The idea startled me. Me owning something again? My name on a lease, my hand shaping each morning? I smiled, but didn't answer. Still, as I walked home later, I caught myself imagining it, a small space filled with warmth, my own rhythm dictating the days. For the first time in decades, the future wasn't an empty hallway. Around that time, Lila's letters started arriving regularly. They were clumsy, uneven, full of misspellings and heart. She wrote about her school projects, her cat, her mother's moods. "Mom says you're too busy for visits," she once wrote. I don't believe her. I think she's the one who's too busy. I laughed softly reading that, the kind of laugh that comes from sadness too deep to be heavy anymore. I began writing back weekly, telling her stories about the bakery, about the people I met, about the smell of cinnamon at dawn. I never spoke ill of her mother. Children don't need to inherit our bitterness. They'll make their own soon enough. In December, the city dressed itself in lights. The bakery window fogged each morning from the heat inside. One day, a man I hadn't seen before came in, a tall figure with silver hair, walking stick, a kind smile. He ordered black coffee and stood near the counter, watching the rain streak the glass. "You have the hands of someone who's done careful work," he said suddenly. I laughed. "I used to be a nurse," I replied. "You learn to be gentle without showing it." He nodded, thoughtful. "That's a rare skill." The next day he returned, and the day after that. His name was Arthur. He'd been a teacher once, widowed now. He spoke softly, like someone who had learned the value of silence. We talked about books, weather, nothing important. Yet every time he left, the shop felt slightly emptier. I hadn't realized how starved I'd become for conversation that didn't require me to prove I existed. It was Arthur who noticed first. "You seem lighter these days," he said one morning, his hand wrapped around the coffee mug. I shrugged. Maybe I stopped trying to be forgiven for things I never did. He smiled as if he understood. That's the trick, isn't it? We spend half our lives apologizing to people who'll never hear it, and the other half waiting for apologies that'll never come. I thought of Eloise, of the way she had looked at me at the wedding, half pity, half embarrassment, and I felt no rage, only distance, clean and final. That night, I walked home with a small bag of pastries Beatrice had insisted I take. The rain had stopped, and the air smelled faintly of bread and frost. Passing the park, I saw a group of teenagers laughing, pushing each other toward the swings, their joy careless, loud. For a moment, I envied their freedom, the way they didn't yet know how quickly laughter turns into silence. Then I realized I wasn't envious at all. I was simply remembering. Memory doesn't ache the same once you've stopped expecting it to return what it took. When I reached my building, I paused before climbing the stairs. In the bakery window below, my reflection merged with the display of loaves, my face framed by warmth and light. It struck me that I had become part of something again, not someone's idea of family, not an accessory to another person's life, but part of the small, breathing world of ordinary kindness. People greeted me now by name, asked about my health, shared their stories. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't waiting. A few days later, Beatrice asked me to come in early for inventory. We worked side by side for hours, measuring flour, checking stock, her radio playing softly in the background. At one point, she looked at me and said, "You know, you could open your own place. You have the patience and the calm for it." I almost laughed, but the idea landed somewhere deep. That night, I made a list of expenses, half out of curiosity, half out of hunger for something larger than survival. It wasn't about ambition. It was about ownership, the smallest, purest form of it. When I went to bed that night, I didn't dream about the wedding or the insults or even the loneliness. I dreamed of shelves lined with bread, of people walking in out of the rain to warmth and light. I dreamed of my hands covered in flour, not as a servant, but as a maker. The dream didn't promise anything. It just waited, patient, impossible. By the time morning came, I knew that something irreversible had begun. Not dramatic, not loud, just steady. The shift wasn't from pain to joy, but from invisibility to presence. The bakery, the letters, the rain, Arthur's voice, all of it formed a quiet rhythm that whispered, "You're still here. You're still becoming." And for the first time since that wedding, I believed it. It began with another letter, as these things often do, thin and white, and carrying the weight of something far heavier than paper. I recognized the handwriting before I even opened it, my daughter's, still neat but tighter now, as if every word were being pulled through clenched teeth. The return address was her new house, a place I had never been invited to, though I had paid for part of the down payment years ago when she had asked for a small loan. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the envelope for nearly an hour, tracing the edges with my finger, feeling that old, familiar dread tighten in my chest. When I finally tore it open, the letter was short, no greeting, no closing, just a message that managed to feel like both a command and a punishment. "Mom, I'm sure you know, but we're expecting a baby in the spring. Please don't post anything about it online or tell anyone until we decide to make it public. We're trying to manage the narrative this time. I'll let you know if we need help." That phrase, "if we need help," settled into me like a stone, as if motherhood were a service that could be outsourced, temporarily recalled only when necessary. I folded the letter carefully and set it beside my cup of tea. I didn't cry, not exactly. Tears felt too simple, too indulgent for what I was feeling. It was something colder, heavier, a fatigue that reached all the way to my bones. I thought of that baby, growing in her, part of me whether she wanted to admit it or not, and of how she had already begun building the walls to keep me out. There was a time when I would have rushed to her side, offered advice, knitted small things, hovered anxiously, desperate to be included. But the years had changed me. I had learned that begging for entry into someone else's life always costs more than the belonging is worth. So instead, I lit a candle, whispered a quiet prayer for the child, and let the flame burn down to nothing before blowing it out. The following weeks passed in a strange haze of normalcy. The bakery grew busier with the holiday season, and my days filled with movement, flour dusting my apron, the bell above the door ringing constantly, the low hum of chatter around the coffee machine. I threw myself into the rhythm of it, finding solace in the physicality of work. Yet beneath the calm, something restless had begun to stir, a quiet discontent that whispered whenever I stopped long enough to listen. It wasn't anger anymore. It was recognition that no matter how far I had come, the shadow of my daughter's judgment still reached into every corner of my life. One Friday evening, just after closing, Beatrice mentioned she'd seen a news segment about Eloise and her husband. "They're quite the power couple," she said with a smile. "You must be proud." I forced a polite laugh, feeling the words land like tiny cuts. Proud. What a curious word. To be proud of someone who pretended you didn't exist. Later that night, alone in my apartment, I searched her name online, something I hadn't done in months. the screen filled instantly with images, her glowing face framed by perfect curls, her husband beside her, handsomely confident, the caption beneath reading Eloise Harland and her husband welcome guests at their annual charity gala. There were dozens of photos, her shaking hands with donors, posing with officials, smiling for cameras, and in one, toward the edge of the frame, I saw something that stopped me cold. My pearl bracelet, the one I'd given her on her wedding day, clasped around her wrist. I leaned closer, my breath catching. She'd worn it, finally, but never once acknowledged it had come from me. In the accompanying interview, she spoke about family traditions, about inheriting strength and grace from the women before her. I wanted to believe that was me she meant, but I knew better. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing her hand, the pearls gleaming under artificial light, a token of my love reduced to a prop in her performance. Around 3 a.m, I made myself tea and sat by the window, watching the city's sleepless pulse flicker through the fog. There's a peculiar loneliness that comes from being erased but remembered selectively, like a photograph cropped to remove your face, but not your shadow. The next morning, I found a message waiting on my phone, a number I didn't recognize. It was Lila. "Grandma, Mom's busy with work. Can I come visit you this weekend? I want to see the bakery." My first instinct was to hesitate. Eloise would never approve, and the last thing I wanted was to cause trouble for the child. But then I thought of that bracelet, of my own reflection dimly caught in its shine, and something inside me stiffened. I typed back, "Of course you can. Saturday morning. I'll be here." She arrived wearing a red coat 2 sizes too big and carrying a small notebook. She was taller now, all elbows and confidence, but her eyes were the same soft hazel as when she was a baby. She looked around the bakery with awe, breathing in the scent of sugar and coffee. "It smells like stories," she said. I laughed. Maybe that's just the cinnamon rolls. We spent the morning together, her helping me arrange pastries, me pretending not to notice how clumsily she stacked them. Customers smiled at her, some asking if she was my granddaughter, and each time I nodded, I felt a warmth I hadn't known in years. She told me about school, her friends, the baby on the way. "Mom says she might hire a nanny," she said matter-of-factly. "She says babies take too much time." I bit my tongue, smiled, and said, "Babies take time, yes, but they give it back in ways you'll understand one day." She looked at me then, curious, like she could sense the edges of something she wasn't old enough to name. When it was time for her to leave, she hugged me tightly, the kind of hug that lingers even after the door closes. Later that evening, I received a text from Eloise. "Did you invite Lila over without telling me? That was inappropriate. Please respect boundaries." I stared at the message for a long time before replying. She wanted to see me. I didn't say no. There was no response. But 2 days later, another envelope arrived. Inside was a letter typed in that same clipped tone she reserved for business. "Mom, while I understand your desire to have a relationship with Lila, I must insist you coordinate through me. Things are delicate right now. Please don't interfere." Beneath her signature, she'd added a note almost as an afterthought. "P.S. The bracelet is beautiful. I've been wearing it lately. It feels lucky." I didn't know whether to laugh or weep. It felt like standing in a hall of mirrors, recognition distorted by distance, gratitude wrapped in control. That night, I didn't light a candle or pray. I just sat in the dark, letting the hurt settle into something less sharp. Maybe this was how relationships die, not with shouting or betrayal, but with small, consistent refusals to see each other as human. Winter deepened, and with it, my sense of isolation grew heavier. Beatrice announced she'd be retiring sooner than planned. Her sister in Italy had fallen ill, and she wanted to go care for her. She offered me the bakery outright, cheaply, kindly, as if she understood what it meant to give someone else the chance to keep living. "You've made this place warmer than I ever could," she said, hugging me. I accepted, though a flicker of fear passed through me. Ownership was responsibility, and responsibility meant visibility again. But I couldn't refuse. For the first time in my life, something truly mine had been handed to me, not out of pity or guilt, but out of respect. The weeks that followed were a blur of paperwork, painting, small repairs. I changed the sign to Marina's Bread, simple and clean. The first morning I opened under my own name, Arthur came in with a bouquet of tulips. "For the new owner," he said, smiling shyly. "You've earned this." I placed the flowers in a glass jar by the window and whispered a quiet thank you. For a while, the joy was steady, unremarkable, real. Then, one cold afternoon in late February, Eloise appeared at the door. She hadn't called or written, just walked in, her expensive coat dusted with snow, her expression tight. "So this is where you spend your time," she said, looking around the bakery as though inspecting a stranger's house. "You own it now?" I nodded. Beatrice retired. I took over. She gave a small laugh that didn't reach her eyes. How quaint. "I suppose it keeps you busy." I said nothing. She ordered a coffee she barely touched, looked out the window, and said, "I'm due next month. I thought you should know." I congratulated her softly, but she didn't look at me. After a long silence, she added, "Mom, I need you to understand that things are different now. My life is public. I can't have surprises, no visits, no calls without notice. It's not personal." I smiled then, the kind of smile that hurts your face because it's holding back a scream. "Everything you do to me is personal, Eloise. You just pretend it isn't." She flinched, then stood abruptly. "You always make it about you." She left without finishing her drink. That night, the bakery felt colder. I closed early, turned off the lights, and sat alone at one of the tables, her untouched cup still there. I thought of the child she carried, the one I would likely never hold, and wondered if some absences begin before the person is even born. 2 weeks later, at dawn, the phone rang. Her voice on the line was tight, brittle. "She's here," she said. "The baby. Lila's sister. We named her Margaret." I congratulated her again, gently. There was a pause. "I suppose you'll want to meet her." "If you want me to," I said carefully. "Not yet," she replied quickly. "Things are hectic." I didn't ask when yet would end. In the months that followed, I wrote letters I never sent, one for each milestone: the baby's birth, her first smile, her first spring. They filled a small box I kept under the counter at the bakery, alongside my savings and a photograph of Lila taken during her visit. Every now and then, Arthur would come by and see the box, ask what it held, and I'd smile. "Just unfinished conversations," I'd say. It was early summer when the real confrontation came. Eloise walked into the bakery again, this time with Lila and the baby in a stroller. Customers turned to look. It was the first time she'd been seen with me in public in years. She smiled for their benefit, the way people do when pretending to reconcile. "Mom," she said brightly, "I thought we'd surprise you." I looked at the baby, round face, pink cheeks, already familiar. "She's beautiful," I whispered. "She looks like you did." Eloise's smile faltered. "Don't start with nostalgia, please. We're just here for coffee." But when she went to sit, the stroller caught the leg of a chair, tipping slightly. Instinct took over. I caught it before it fell. For a moment, our hands touched on the handle, her eyes wide with something like recognition or fear. Then she pulled back, muttering thanks. The rest of the visit was polite, suffocating. When they left, the bell over the door chimed softly, and I stood there in the quiet, shaking. The past had returned, not as memory, but as repetition. Yet this time, I wasn't powerless. This time, I had something she could neither give nor take away. My own life, shaped by my own hands. That was the second escalation. The moment the past came knocking again, dressed in new clothes, testing the strength of what I'd built. And though my hands trembled after she left, it wasn't from weakness. It was from the weight of holding everything together and realizing finally that I could. It happened on a Tuesday that felt like any other, the kind of day that arrives without announcement and leaves a seam in your life you can only see when the light hits just right. I had opened the bakery at 5, breathed in the first warm gust from the ovens, counted the till, arranged the morning loaves so they looked like they had risen not just from flour and yeast, but from a promise I had made to myself when no one was looking, and by 9, the regulars had passed through with their customary nods and jokes and weather complaints. Arthur had left a folded newspaper and a note about a book I should borrow from the library, and I was rinsing a metal pitcher at the sink when the bell rang and a courier stepped in with a manila envelope that bore my name in the tidy, efficient script of someone paid to be certain. I dried my hands, signed, and slit the top with the butter knife we keep for scones, already feeling the old dread gathering at the base of my neck like a storm cloud that remembers the roof lines it once drowned. Inside the envelope were 2 papers, a glossy invitation, and a summons dressed up as a request. The invitation announced a charity luncheon hosted by my daughter's firm. Women in leadership, capital for new mothers, photographs promised in tasteful black and white, and the letter, on letterhead, informed me that my presence as family would be appreciated for optics. Those words italicized, as if the truth required a different font to pass through the skin. There was a line at the bottom: kindly refrain from personal remarks. Keep remarks brief and positive, that told me everything I needed to know about the role I was expected to play. A vase on a stage, a backdrop that smiles. I set the pages down beside the sink, turned off the water, and stood very still as the bakery settled around me. The glass cases humming, the kettle ticking as it cooled, and in the sudden quiet, I realized that for years I had mistaken endurance for love, that I had accepted the terms of a contract I never signed, and that the only person with the authority to nullify it was standing there with wet hands and a heartbeat she could finally hear. I closed early, hung the sign that says back at 4, even though we never are, swept the floor with a slowness that felt like thought, then took out the tin box where I keep my unfinished conversations, spread my letters across the flour-dusted prep table, and began to write, not the trembling pleas of a mother who wants to be invited to the table, not the dignified vagueness of someone afraid to lose access to a child's good mood, but a clear, precise document in a voice I had used in operating rooms and midnight hallways, and once, many years ago, in a lawyer's office, when I learned that plain language is a sanctuary. I wrote her name, and then my own, and then the date, and I stated that I would not attend as a prop or a propitiation, that I would not be edited into palatability, that I would not lend my face to a performance that had starved me for years. I wrote that love is not attendance, that support is not obedience, that motherhood is not an on-call function for public relations, and then I itemized every contribution I had made to her adult life. the deposits and dresses, and down payments and flights, and all the meals cooked when she was too tired to remember what hunger meant. And beneath the tidy list, I wrote the sentence that drew the line I had avoided drawing for decades. This is a ledger, not a leash. Our accounts are closed. But it was not enough to write to her, because letters can be folded into drawers, and righteousness can be mistaken for noise. So I wrote 2 more documents. The first to my attorney. Yes, I have one now. A woman with kind eyes and a spine like iron, who eats almonds between appointments and never mistakes my softness for confusion, in which I executed a trust for the bakery and named my granddaughter Lila as beneficiary of its proceeds should I die or lose the strength to knead dough, with a clause that made explicit what politeness might later try to blur, that my daughter would have no claim upon the business or its assets, or the small savings I had coaxed from early mornings, and the dignity of work. And the second document was a health care directive, an old nurse finally tending to her own chart, removing my daughter as emergency contact and appointing Arthur and Beatrice's niece, who lives 2 blocks away and knows where I keep my medication list, as the people empowered to decide with me and for me, because love is not control and concern is not custody. By the time I finished, the bakery smelled of sugar and ink and the faint, clean heat that lingers when a thing is decided. I walked these papers to the notary with my coat unbuttoned because the air had turned honest, stamped them with seals that pressed the world into recognition, mailed the letter to my daughter certified, and slipped the trust into the tin box. And when I returned to the shop, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, poured a glass of water, and sat at the corner table where the morning light collects in a square on the wood. The same table where Lila had drawn a crooked croissant months before. I lifted the water, watched the surface shiver, and thought of the wedding, of the way my hand had moved before I had time to think. And then I drank, not in a gesture of refusal or spite, but as a ceremony of ownership, the first swallow for the woman who had held everyone else's thirst for so long that she forgot the sound her own relief could make. 2 days later, I went to the luncheon anyway, not as a concession, but as a witness to the end of an era. I wore the navy coat and the bracelet she had made public without remembering its origin. I paid for my ticket and sat at the back near a ficus whose leaves had the dull sheen of plants that survive in rooms designed for photographs. I listened to women deliver speeches built from careful nouns and aspirational verbs. I applauded for the ones who meant what they said. And when my daughter took the stage, there was a soft murmur, the room bending toward her. She spoke well because she has always spoken well. She talked about lineage and scaffolding and how success is a ladder. And then she gestured to the corner where I sat and said, with a smile that warmed the first rows and left the rest of us in shade, that her mother was in the audience, that she had taught her resilience and poise, and would I stand, please, so they could thank me. There was a camera aimed at the aisle. There were hands poised to clap, and the part of me that had obeyed for half a century rose like a ghost and tugged at my sleeve. I did not stand. Instead, I lifted my hand and kept my seat, and when the room turned to look at me, I smiled, the kind of smile that belongs to a woman who has paid her debts and learned the price of her silence. And I said, not loudly, but clearly enough to be heard without amplification, I am here as a private citizen, not a prop. And then I lowered my hand and remained in my chair, the ficus steadfast at my shoulder. And what happened next was not dramatic, a ripple of surprise, a few awkward claps that collapsed into stillness, the subtle tightening of my daughter's jaw before she moved on with the speech. But inside me, something irreversible fell into place, with the soft click of a lock you didn't know you'd been carrying open. I felt tall in my chair. I felt exact, and no one could make that small again. Afterward, in the hallway outside the ballroom, her husband approached with that congenial smile men wear when they believe charm can tidy what control has disordered. He thanked me for coming, said he hoped we could coordinate better next time, and that word, coordinate, landed between us like a polite blade. I told him there would not be a next time of the kind he imagined, that my life was not a staging area, that proximity is not permission, and when he asked, with a laugh that sought allies in the carpet and the chandelier, whether I truly meant to exclude myself from family occasions, I said that I had not excluded myself. I had excused myself, an act of courtesy to everyone who prefers me edited, and I watched as the comprehension rearranged his features into something less certain. Then I walked past him toward the exit with my coat open and my hands empty. I returned to the bakery and turned the sign to open, though the hour was late, because I wanted the room to breathe with me. Arthur came in on his way from the library and listened while I told him the plain version. He did not congratulate me, because he is wise enough to know that reclaiming yourself is not a victory march, but a surgery, bloodless only if you do it fast and clean. He poured water into a glass and set it in front of me and said, with the softness of someone who has worked a long time to sound like himself, that there are decisions which, once made, give back the hours they took to make. And I nodded because I could already feel time returning, not with fanfare, but like tap water finally running clear after years of rust. That night, I wrote one last letter, not to my daughter, not to a lawyer, but to Lila. I told her that I would always answer her notes, that she could find me by the smell of bread and the sound of the bell over the door, that love is a verb you do in kitchens and quiet corners, not a spotlight that burns the subject and blinds the audience. I told her that sometimes saving someone looks like handing them a glass, and sometimes it looks like keeping your own. And I did not dramatize or predict or instruct. I simply told the truth the way my hands tell the truth when they test a loaf's bottom for that hollow sound that means it is done. And when I finished, I placed the letter in the tin with the trust papers and the spare key, and I slept with the window cracked and the city going about its business as if nothing had changed, which is how you know something has, because the world no longer presses its shape against you. In the morning, I woke before the alarm, put on my coat, and opened the bakery to the hour's first blue. And as the ovens exhaled heat and the dough rose under cloth, I understood that I had not chosen against my daughter. I had chosen for myself, a distinction so fine it had taken me a lifetime to feel it. And that choice, once made, could not be unmade, not by apology, not by spectacle, not even by love, because it was not a verdict. It was a boundary. And boundaries, when true, are simply the shape a life takes when it finally belongs to the person living it. The seasons turned again, quietly, as they always do when no one is watching, and the bakery became my clock, each sunrise marked by the soft percussion of dough against the counter, and each evening sealed by the faint hum of cooling ovens. Time no longer something to survive, but something to inhabit. The air inside smelled perpetually of comfort, flour, butter, coffee, and sometimes I wondered if this was what peace truly was, not joy, not triumph, but the steady, unremarkable hum of belonging to one's own days. Customers came and went, faces I knew, faces I'd never see again, and I learned the gentle art of remembering without expecting, of caring without needing to be named in return. It was a discipline, almost like prayer, one that asked nothing of me except presence, and presence I had discovered was what I had been starved for all my life. Eloise did not come to the bakery again after the luncheon, though once or twice I saw her face in a magazine at the newsstand, her smile sharp and her posture practiced. She looked the way she always wanted to look, composed, admired, untouchable, and for the first time I did not feel the usual sting of invisibility, only a faint curiosity, as if I were studying a distant relative whose features resembled mine only by coincidence. I did not hate her. I did not even blame her anymore. Blame is just another tether, and I had cut enough of those to know that forgiveness, when it comes, is not a gift you hand to another person, but a door you unlock for yourself so that air can return. I wished her well in the way one wishes for good weather, not because it changes your plans, but because it makes the world gentler to live in. Sometimes at night, I imagined her reading the letter I'd sent, maybe not understanding, maybe pretending not to, and I realized it didn't matter. The letter wasn't for her comprehension. It was for my release. Lila kept writing, her handwriting now tighter, older, the letters less looped, more deliberate. She wrote about school, about the baby. Maggie laughs when I tickle her. Mom says she has your cheeks. And sometimes she asked questions she didn't know were questions, like why grown-ups stop talking to each other, or whether people can love in silence. I answered each one honestly but simply, careful not to lay the weight of my story on her small shoulders. I told her that sometimes silence is the way love rests when it's tired, that people forget how to listen because they mistake noise for closeness, and that the hardest part of growing up is realizing some stories don't have villains, only people who could not find their way back to tenderness in time. Her replies became the rhythm of my weeks. I would find her envelopes in the morning mail and feel the small flare of connection that had nothing to do with duty, only choice. And it reminded me that lineage can skip a generation to find its true home. Arthur began coming by more often, sometimes staying after closing to help me count the till or to share a pot of tea while we listened to the city's muted noise through the window. We spoke about ordinary things, the news, the neighborhood, books, but beneath the conversation ran a quiet understanding, an affection unannounced, unclaimed, like a warm current under cold water. I think we both knew we were too old to pretend at beginnings and too wise to fear endings, so we existed in the middle, where peace lives. One evening he reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. No declaration, no question, just that simple touch of recognition that says, I see you and I am seen. And I realized then that intimacy was not the grand passion I had once imagined, but the permission to exist without apology in someone's sight. We sat that way until the streetlights blinked on, two survivors of our own stubborn hearts, finally letting the quiet hold us without shame. Spring arrived again, and with it, a soft letter embossed with my daughter's name. I hesitated before opening it, thinking it might be another performance of courtesy, but inside was a short note, handwritten, almost hesitant. Mom, Lila told me about your bakery. She loves it there. Thank you for being kind to her. I'm glad she knows you. Nothing more, no apology, no invitation, just acknowledgement. And that was enough. It was not reconciliation, but recognition, the difference subtle yet profound. I placed the letter in my tin box with the others and felt the faintest sense of symmetry. Life rarely gives you closure, but sometimes it grants you punctuation, and that, I decided, was mercy enough. Now, in the mornings, I open the bakery at 5 as always, and sometimes Lila helps before school, sweeping, refilling sugar jars, humming under her breath. She has her mother's focus, but not her mother's armor. She laughs easily, freely, her joy uncurated. Customers adore her, and I watch her move through the world with a grace that feels like a quiet redemption. She is the proof that love, when it survives, does so not by force, but by persistence. She is the continuation I didn't know I needed. One afternoon, she asked if she could hang a photo behind the counter, a picture of the two of us covered in flour, laughing over a failed batch of muffins. I said yes, of course. And when she left that evening, I looked at it for a long time, the image slightly crooked, imperfect, alive, and thought, this is the family I recognize, not the one that posed for cameras, but the one that exists between gestures where no one is performing. Sometimes I still dream of that wedding night, but it no longer carries pain. In the dream, I'm standing at the edge of the vineyard, the lights strung across the trees swaying in the wind. I'm holding a glass of water, clear, steady, and this time, when my daughter's voice echoes through the laughter, I don't flinch. I simply set the glass down on the table and walk away. The scene continues without me, but I no longer feel absent because I've learned that absence can also be presence when it's chosen. I wake from the dream calm, the air cool on my face, and I lie there for a while, grateful that memory has finally softened into story. Now, when women come into the bakery, some with the exhaustion of new motherhood, some with the quiet loneliness of midlife, I recognize their expressions, the invisible hunger to be seen beyond usefulness, and I offer them coffee, a seat, a small piece of something sweet. It's not advice I give them, but permission, the silent kind that passes from one survivor to another, a look that says, you are not wrong to want peace, and they smile, not always knowing why, but I can tell the warmth reaches them. Sometimes they stay longer than they meant to, staring at nothing, breathing differently, and when they leave, I feel as if some invisible cycle has been gentled, if not broken. Maybe that's what purpose means at this age, not to change the world, but to hold a small corner of it steady so others can rest for a moment before they go back out. When I close each night, I turn off the lights slowly, one by one, leaving only the soft glow above the counter, and I sit with a final cup of tea, the city whispering outside. I think of the women I once was, the young nurse with shaking hands, the wife who mistook compromise for care, the mother who carried her child's cruelty like proof of her own failure. And I see now they were all trying, each one doing her best with the tools she had, none of them wrong, just unfinished. I wish I could gather them all here, seat them at one table, pour them tea, and tell them that we made it, that the storm didn't win, that love didn't vanish, it just changed its address. I would tell them that freedom, when it finally comes, doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It arrives quietly, carrying a key to a door you built yourself, and when you open it, the air smells like bread. So this is how it ends, or maybe how it continues, because endings, I've learned, are just softer beginnings for people who have finally stopped asking permission to exist. I am 82 now. The bakery is modestly successful. The mornings are mine, and the evenings are gentle. Sometimes Arthur reads while I wipe down the counters. Sometimes Lila phones just to say goodnight. Sometimes the city feels like an old friend who has forgiven me for outliving my usefulness. And I smile because I know better now. Usefulness was never the measure of a woman's worth, only her breath, her persistence, her refusal to vanish when the world decided she should. I light a candle on the counter, not for prayer, but for memory. And as the flame steadies, I whisper to the quiet room, you did well, old girl. You learned to drink first. And then I blow out the candle, lock the door, and walk home through the twilight, the smell of warm bread following me like something faithful that never once asked for thanks.